I would encourage people to dig into this because there is an explanation for the way that human beings are. There's a solution that God provides, and he underlines the fact, he explains why we have failed every time to conquer the darkest things about ourselves and what his solution is. And you find that by digging into church history, and by digging into prophetic history, you start to see very clearly that human nature hasn't changed, and you start to understand why we're always disappointed when we try to fix the things that plague us most. And then you get this ray of hope on the horizon. My goodness, someone saw all this, they understand it all, and they're telling us there is a solution coming, and that's just a mind-blowing experience.
My family and I love history, and especially U.S. history. And so, with my daughter now almost 8 years old, we have made it a regular practice to study early American history and visit national historic sites and parks whenever we can. However, as a Christian, I find it impossible to study our nation's history without seeing the hand of God all along the way. From the first voyage of Christopher Columbus to early interactions between Native Americans and the first European pilgrims and settlers, to develop the beliefs and values that would one day shape our nation and form the basis of the Constitution that still stands today. God has indeed providentially built and blessed this nation. Of course, the core principles guiding this nation have always been liberty and justice for all, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and the rights and equality of man. The United States of America was the first nation ever to exist without a king or a pope, and God has truly blessed her beyond measure. But what happens when the country begins to reject the values that stand at its foundation? What happens when truth and liberty are exchanged for corruption and control? Could the freedoms we have taken for granted as a nation now be at risk? Could we be returning to the very thing we rejected when this nation was created? And does Bible prophecy have anything to say about it? In this episode, I was privileged to interview Pastor Shawn Boonstra. For those of you who don't know, Shawn has been serving the church in various capacities for almost 30 years and is currently the speaker and director of Voice of Prophecy, a radio program and evangelistic ministry that reaches millions of people every year with the gospel. Shawn is also a sought-after speaker and often can be found organizing local evangelistic events in cities around the world. I got a chance to meet Shawn in person earlier this year at a conference his ministry sponsored, and have always been inspired by his thoughtful, down-to-earth approach to making Bible prophecy relevant and accessible. I hope you're inspired with my conversation as much as I was. I started the interview by asking him what he's up to these days.
Man, we are busier than a one-legged soccer player, and that's a visual that maybe is curious to some, but that's about as busy as a person can get. And we're turning out all kinds of new stuff. We're working on a new series that comes out here in a couple of months, and we're also down in studio. We've got 2 or 3 regular weekly radio broadcasts that we produce downstairs, and so we're just running around like chickens with our heads cut off. But it's great. Travis, I just got a letter from a guy in prison who's got no access to Christianity or God, and he listens every week, and I was in tears reading this thing this morning that it's making a difference. So we're happy to be that kind of busy.
Amen. Yeah, and we're going to be talking about that event that's happening, or that you were just mentioning in a little bit here. But before we get into that, tell us a little bit about your own experience with Bible prophecy. I know that the ministry you're involved in is called Voice of Prophecy. And so, obviously that has been meaningful in your own life. So when did you first encounter Bible prophecy, and how did that affect your own life at that time?
Well, I think that the first encounter probably, I didn't recognize how it impacted me. But when I was, we're going way back into ancient history, but when I was a kid, I learned to read by reading the Bible. And my parents bought me like this cheap children's paraphrase that was popular back in the ancient days in the 60s and 70s. And so I started reading that thing. And of course, I wandered over as a kid to the book of Revelation, and it blew my mind. And I didn't understand a lick of it. I mean, we're beasts crawling out of the sea, trumpets, and all this stuff. I didn't really get it. And but I was fascinated by it, because how do you not be fascinated by this strange and wonderful book there at the end of the Bible? And some of the language, it said, "Behold, I come quickly." That's Jesus is going to come back. And I remember running into the backyard, looking up in the sky and thinking, well, he must be happening any moment now. I want to be out here watching when it does. And that's really early childhood. A little bit later on, late 8, 9, 10, 12 years of age, I got invited to a Bible camp, and they started showing these movies about Bible prophecy. And I'm not sure those all left the best impression. Everybody disappeared out of the world, and the Antichrist comes and starts killing people, and then they'd play eerie music. And I don't know, that probably scared me more than anything. But it made me curious, I guess, in the earliest days. And I guess as a kid, I also thought, well, this is impossible to understand. They're just kind of guessing at all this stuff. And so I'm not sure I grasped it in my earliest experience. I guess I was exposed to it is the best way to describe it. But then later, after a little bit of time in the wilderness, Travis, I call myself a recovering heathen to this day. I did go out into the wilderness. I know God doesn't have any grandchildren, and I lived a rough life. And it was actually Bible prophecy that brought me back to believing in God and anchored me. And now we're talking late teens, early 20s. And at this point, I guess this will date me, the first Gulf War is breaking out, and I'm watching these tracer bullets, go across the night sky. A lot of people remember those images in the first Gulf War. And I had this neighbor who said, "Oh, I bet this is Armageddon." And suddenly I think, "Oh yeah, I read about that somewhere." Remembered my childhood. And then it started an exploration that brought me into complete belief in the Bible and the existence of God, and more than that, not just that he existed, but he's accessible, and that he cares, and that he wants to be in my life, and that my universe can make sense. So it took a couple of decades for me to get to where I should have probably landed much earlier, but it was maybe the first time, I don't know, as I started to explore Bible prophecy and figure out what it said and what it didn't say, that it was a huge eye-opener. Suddenly I thought, man, this book, there's more to this. This is not a piece of religious propaganda. Something's behind this book that is inexplicable unless there's a God.
Wow. And so it was not just a collection of facts and collecting, this, for sharing table conversations around the dinner table, but you were saying that your encounter with Bible prophecy actually was instrumental in your conversion story.
Oh yeah, there's no question about it. And I was raised by godly parents. They read the Bible to us at night, and so I had early exposure. But suddenly God was real when I really started to dig in and get past. There's a lot of fluff in the bookstores about Bible prophecy and a lot of guesswork going on. But when I really started to read the entire Bible and see how it's structured, and that Revelation is not just the ramblings of a madman, but that it's actually anchored in the other 65 books, yeah, there was no. I guess there was no escaping it anymore. God was real, and He wanted me to understand that He knows I exist, that He cares about my future, and that I can have some peace of mind in this world. So it's deeply personal to me.
Mm. And so, beyond the curiosity effect, because sometimes I wonder, and maybe somebody's listening and they are just curious about Bible prophecy, and they don't really see anything beyond that. But how have you been able to maintain that interest over the years? You learned it, and some might say, okay, now I know it, so I'm just going to move on with my life. Why have you continued to be interested in it, and why do you think it's relevant today? Why do you think it's something that others should pursue as well?
Well, here's the issue: is like you say, well, you learned it. Now I'd say I'm learning it, and I've barely approached the tip of this iceberg. Somebody once said to me, if something is man-made, you will notice the flaws. So, for example, a napkin or a tablecloth looks beautiful, but put it under a microscope and you're going to see that the weave isn't perfect and that threads are breaking and it's not perfect. But if God's in it, you put it under the microscope and you will never stop seeing the perfection of the thing. So a snowflake or something, so have I learned it? No, I'm still learning it. You can't get to the bottom of this. And the further I go, the more sense it makes, the more everything hangs together. And I guess I got addicted to it. And what's interesting, I hated history in school. My goodness, I hated history. And it may have something to do with the fact that I had to study Canadian history in school, and we're just too nice and polite to actually do anything that makes the story exciting. But when I started to dig into this, I can't hit the bottom of it. I mean, I've got 4,000 books on history in my study, and 3 more arrived from Amazon last night. I'm breaking my family's budget on this stuff. I'm still learning. So how do I maintain my interest in it? My goodness, if you get into this stuff, you will be there a long, long time. It's like, how do you explore the universe? Do you look through the telescope a couple of times? Now I learned it? No. You suddenly realize that it's infinite out there, and there's so much to learn. I got addicted to it, and more than just the facts, and I'm glad you pointed that out. The facts are amazing, and I find new facts almost every day. But it's the God behind that stuff. It's like, the world is a mess, and he puts up these signposts along the way to let you know where you are in his universe. And it gives you this peace of mind of knowing that someone's actually running the show. Somebody's in control out there. Doesn't violate our freedom of choice, but he's in charge. Well, that's a good feeling. And you get addicted to that one, knowing that there is a God who cares. How do I maintain it? Get started, with a holistic approach to Bible prophecy. Understand how it was structured, and you're not going to be able to help yourself. It'll be your best addiction ever.
Well, that's encouraging because I think, and this is true for, I think, Christianity in general. A lot of us are just kind of satisfied with the surface level of understanding with not just Bible prophecy, but all aspects of what the Bible teaches. And clearly this, experience that you had as a young man has, is blossomed. And so you are now the speaker and director of Voice of Prophecy. Maybe for someone who doesn't know or isn't familiar with Voice of Prophecy, kind of share a little bit about the vision behind it, and maybe a little of the history. Sure. Just into where we are today with that ministry.
Sure. I wasn't around when this thing started. I believe we may be the oldest faith-based broadcast, certainly in radio, that's and continuously on the air. I think the whole world, and I could be wrong about that, but I believe it's true. First went on the air in 1929, and I think the first broadcast was October 19 that year, and 5 days later, the market crashes. We go into the Great Depression. It's an interesting time in history. The guy's name was HMS Richards. Was one of the legends of Christian radio broadcasting. He was actually recording his show in a chicken coop in the beginning because he didn't have a dime to operate with, delivering the recordings to KNX Radio in Los Angeles, and from there, within a few years, it went global. It used to not be called the Voice of Prophecy. When it started, I think they called it the Tabernacle of the Air, which is a very 1920s sounding title, and then became the Voice of Prophecy. And here's what's curious is they absolutely did focus on prophecy, but not the way that you see people do it today. People are almost trying to scare people with prophecy or impress you with their facts and their knowledge. It was always very Christ-centered, and it was always about having people understand that God exists, that he loves you, that he desires to be in your life, and have a personal relationship with you. Prophecy was a big part of that, of course. HMS Richards, I believe, went on to predict that Hitler was going to lose based on his understanding of Daniel chapter 2 and the prophecy that you find there. And some people said, well, that's risky. How do you know? Because Hitler looked like he might win a lot of Europe and establish himself at that point. He says, no. Daniel 2, and he was absolutely right. And he helped a generation understand that the Bible is trustworthy. And then the big reason for wanting that is to know that there is a God who is trustworthy behind that.
Yeah. And it's kind of interesting because you guys on your podcast, you guys have re-released some of those classic episodes, and I've had a chance
absolutely.
to go back and listen to, I don't know how many of them you have released, but I know I went back and just listened to a few of them, and I really enjoyed it. I mean, it's kind of like going to church on the radio, but it was just, you just feel like you're being taken back in time, and yet when you listen to what they're talking about, it's like, wow, they're talking about the same thing that we're talking about today. And because, the Bible is still relevant, and the topics that, the fears and the anxieties and the concerns, obviously they the context changes, but the human need and the human desire for answers is still the same.
Well, here's what I find interesting. They do sound old-timey radio, which is why I like them. But you're right, the content hasn't had to shift a whole lot. We speak a little differently now, 100 years later. We're 90 years old this year, I guess. And culture has shifted a little bit, but the most profound needs of human beings don't shift at all. They just don't. They haven't in thousands of years. And here's what I find interesting is that HMS Richards established this, reading the Bible and reading prophecy the way that Christians did for like the first 1,800 years of Christianity's experience. It comes as a surprise to a lot of people to discover that the way that we talk about prophecy today, and the fact that you can go into a bookstore and buy 100 books on prophecy and get 100 different, radically different opinions, it wasn't always that way. There was general, not in every detail, but there was general unanimity on what prophecy was saying and how it was structured for 1,800 years. And HMS was in that tradition, and the things he said still apply today. We've not had to apologize for anything because we've taken sort of the historical approach that Christians have always had to understanding prophecy. And we don't have to move the markers. We don't have to change our minds every 2 months because we're looking at the big picture. And I really did appreciate that about him. And, those broadcasts, they sound old-timey and so on, but they still apply. We haven't had to apologize for any of them.
Yeah, and I like that's a good transition because I was thinking, this historical approach to Bible prophecy is something that you've been working on with producing some miniseries, and I personally have enjoyed them. The first one came out a few years ago called Shadow Empire, and then another one you produced was called The Pale Horse Rides, and essentially they're kind of the history of the Christian church since the adoption by Constantine of Christianity into the Roman Empire around the 4th century. So can you share a little bit about, what motivated you to produce those two miniseries, and just share a little bit about what was the content in those series?
Sure. I sometimes turn on the TV and I watch all the preachers who are talking about prophecy, and I'm thinking, my goodness, why do we have to change our mind about what prophecy says every couple of weeks and keep moving the goalposts? If we were to go back to the way that Christians have historically understood prophecy, it makes clear sense. And one of the things that's really mind-blowing about it is that almost nothing that's happened in the Christian world for the last 2,000 years should have caught us by surprise. There's remarkable detail in the Bible. Now, here's what's interesting, Travis. I mean, if you go back and read Christian writers from, say, the 19th century and the 17th century, it blows your mind. These people not only did they virtually know the Bible by heart, some of the great ones, but they had a profound sense of this idea that God has been working with his people continuously since the day Christ went back to heaven, and revealing himself through history and working with his people through history, much the way he did in the Old Testament with Israel. Our ancestors in Christianity, going back just a couple of hundred years, were historically literate, and mind-blowingly so. I mean, I can't believe their understanding. Here's an example. There were those in the 19th century who were able to predict right to the day the downfall and humiliation of the Ottoman Empire. In 1840, they suffered a major blow, and they were saying, well, we know what's coming for the Ottoman Empire. We found it in Bible prophecy, and they were absolutely right. And they didn't have flavor of the month. They were watching God unfold throughout history. And so that's one of the things that I wanted to underline is like, look, it makes sense. Nothing has caught God by surprise. Nothing should catch us by surprise. And I want to recapture that profound sense of history. Christianity is a historical religion. It's not a bunch of facts. It's God revealing himself to people and working with people over the course of history, and he's got a target in mind. And, you know, today a lot of people point out, oh, Christianity's gone off the rails. Christians aren't Christ-like. I don't argue with them because they're right. Mm-hmm. They're absolutely right. You know, they say, well, Christianity's become a business. Yep, we did. And they become a political lobby. Yeah, we did. And what's interesting is that none of that should have caught us by surprise. If you start to read the Bible historically and understand how Christians have always read prophecy, none of that would have caught us by surprise. It actually predicted that Christians would walk some of the same paths that Israel did. And the Old Testament is a story of what God's people did wrong. They were worshiping idols. They were abandoning the covenant with God. And the book of Revelation revealed that Christians would walk the same path and do the same things. So when Christians are driving the Muslims and Jews out of Spain in the 15th century, the Bible didn't predict that specific event, but it absolutely predicted that we would have that attitude and develop it, and it's not what God wanted for us. And this is one of the reasons that the book of Revelation, 2/3 of the language is actually borrowed from the Old Testament. John the Revelator is repeating the warnings of Old Testament prophets, but he's applying it to the church. And I guess I've wandered off the question a little bit, but that's what's behind these series is like, look, none of this was a surprise. The church did go off the rails. Mm-hmm. We started to blend church and state, and we started to mix Roman-style politics with Christianity in the 4th century. It was predicted. It happened exactly as predicted. And there is a story about what the future holds as well, and that there is a way back to being a more Christ-like Christianity.
So for someone who is unfamiliar with church history, and I find surprisingly that maybe not so surprisingly because people don't read anymore, but there's a surprisingly high level of ignorance about a lot of these events. They're not usually taught in even our standard history classes. Usually it seems like history ends at the fall of Roman Empire and begins again at Columbus, and all that stuff happening in between we don't even teach here. So I learned some things through what you were able to share. So just briefly kind of give an overview of what exactly you were able to uncover in those two series.
Right. Oh my goodness, yeah, and of course the series, we could go on for hours. I could go on for weeks about it, but we kind of boiled it down that there came this moment in Christianity where when Christians were persecuted, and by the way, that was also predicted in the Bible. It was quite clear. We take a look at Revelation 6 and what Christians have historically understood by that chapter. We see that the birth of the Christian church is predicted, the persecution by the pagan Roman Empire is predicted, but then it shows this move where when Christians are having, the persecution ends with the Edict of Milan. Constantine's mother was a practicing Christian. I do raise questions about how much of a practicing Christian Constantine himself was, because even after his professed conversion, he's still killing off family members he considers a threat, and he refuses to get baptized almost to the day he dies. But he's Christian. He's a Christian emperor rather. He defines himself as such, and he looks at these Christians who were being horribly persecuted by Diocletian, the Roman emperor, and he sees how united they are, and he thinks, man, I'm going to unite the entire Roman Empire. Up to his day, there had been 4 emperors, sort of the tetrarchy was ruling the empire. He thinks, if I convert the empire to Christianity, these Christians are so united, my empire will be united. Now, he probably should have met some Christians before he came to that conclusion. Right. Because, we're not always united, and the Bible points that out, too, that, It's the Bible's not afraid of pointing out Christian sins.
No,
and
it's not.
so a bunch of go ahead.
I was just agreeing with you. I said, no, it's definitely not,
Yeah.
not silent on
No,
that.
we're human. Yeah, we're not human. We're human beings. So these disputes emerge in the church. The Arian controversy in North Africa, the Donatist controversy, a whole bunch of these controversies arise. And when Christians can't settle it themselves, they say, you know what? The Roman emperor's on our side now. Let's appeal to him. And so they drag the Roman Empire into their discussions. And the next thing you know, you get a blend, and not a healthy blend. We start looking at the church as a political tool, and we start looking at the state as a religious tool, and it's the beginning of an awful lot of heartache. So there is an explanation for the things we were doing. The Inquisition, burning heretics at the stake. Jesus didn't do any of those things, but Christians did. And it was born, for example, Constantine noticed Diocletian burning people at the stake to deal with their resistance against the Roman Empire, and we adopted the same thing later on. Let's deal with heretics the way the Romans deal with heretics. And my goodness, we made a mess of the religion of Christ. And then we looked at another series, Pale Horse Rides, and we say, well, there's got to be genuine biblical Christianity. Surely we weren't all behaving like that. And so we looked at this, we kind of did a thought experiment. There's a Christian church that exists in the British Isles off the coast in Ireland that emerged. Basically, all they had was a copy of the Bible. And we asked the question, what would happen if all you had was a copy of the Bible and you didn't have the Roman emperor influencing it? And we get this remarkably New Testament-looking church emerging in basically in Ireland and on rocky coasts, hiding from all the junk that's going on in the Western Roman Empire. And so that's Pale Horse Rides. Remember, there was a biblical Christianity, one that strove to stick with the teachings of Jesus, and that one's exciting. And so you get this contrast between a corrupted Christianity and one that tries to adhere to the teachings of Christ. And in Pale Horse Rides, we find out that Revelation predicted that as well, that there would be sort of a church hiding in the wilderness that would stick with the truth, and that one day a lot of that truth would reemerge just before Jesus comes again. I don't know if that covers. That's a lot of history, and it's 1,300 years worth of history.
Well, I just recommend those miniseries because I really personally enjoyed them, and I know my church did as well. And so when you think about looking back at church history, if someone's thinking, well, I'm not really much into church history. It just seems kind of boring to me. And you even said it yourself. At one point, you were not that into it.
Oh,
yourself.
I hated history, Travis. Oh my goodness, I hated it. Didn't make sense to me.
So
what's the point? They're all dead. Why would we study all these dead people? That was my attitude earlier.
So what case would you make for the 21st century Christian? Digging into some of this stuff. Why is it relevant? Why is this old Christian history that some would say, well, that's, we're not like that anymore. That was, our barbaric time of existence, and we've been enlightened since then, and we'll never go back to that again. So why should someone even spend the time looking at it?
Now, wouldn't it be nice if that was true, that human beings had conquered the darkest things about themselves? As we get to the end of the 19th century and into the early 20th century, we actually have records in the British Hansard, the records of what was being said in Parliament, where people are standing up and saying, we've now become so enlightened, coming out of the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution, the Scientific Revolution, the Enlightenment. We've put an end to war. Well, then we move straight into the bloodiest century in the history of the planet, 203 million people killed in the 20th century. And that creates all kinds of disillusionment, generates postmodern thinking, saying, well, I guess we really can't understand anything. And now we live in a world where there's no black and white, no understanding anything. I would encourage people to dig into this because there is an explanation for the way that human beings are. There's a solution that God provides, and he underlines the fact, he explains why we have failed every time to conquer the darkest things about ourselves and what his solution is. And you find that by digging into church history, by digging into prophetic history, you start to see very clearly that human nature hasn't changed, and you start to understand why we're always disappointed when we try to fix the things that plague us most. And then you get this ray of hope on the horizon. My goodness, someone saw all this, they understand it all, and they're telling us there is a solution coming. And that's just a mind-blowing experience. What I would encourage people to do is, look, study Jesus. If you hate history, study Jesus. Nobody hates Jesus. Even his worst critics have to say, well, he's, you can't argue with Jesus. We might not think he's the Son of God, but can't argue with that. Study Jesus, look at it, and then start to dig into some of the historical events that surround his life. And I promise you, you're going to get hooked, even if you hate history. You'll notice, for example, who's Herod the Great? Herod the Great, the one who tried to have all the babies killed. You start reading about him, and you discover he was tried before the Sanhedrin exactly like Jesus did, with a different result. The Roman Empire came in to save him from the Sanhedrin instead of crucifying him. Then you get the sack of the temple by the Romans, and how Jesus predicted that not one stone would be left upon another. And to this day, you can visit Jerusalem, and all that's left is a heap of stones from the former temple. And once you start digging into the specifics around Jesus' life, you'll start realizing none of that was a surprise. It was predicted centuries in advance, and you start to wonder, I wonder if these other predictions for our future are also reliable. You'll get hooked. And I think the message for me, Travis, is this. There's nothing new under the sun. The problems we face in the 21st century are not new. We like to think it's new because, as you said, we don't know history like we used to. I think for most of us, our knowledge of history doesn't go back to before World War II. But once you start to see it, you get peace of mind. Somebody's watching, somebody's in control, and there is a way out of this mess.
Yeah, and especially interesting when it's not just history, but like you said, Bible prophecy is basically history given to us in advance, right? And so for us today, we can look back and say, yeah, this stuff already happened, but when you look at the time when the book of Revelation was written, or the book of Daniel, or one of the other prophetic apocalyptic books of the Bible, obviously they were written minimally like 2,000 years ago and beyond, and yet you see this historical outline, a sense that you find in the book of Revelation, and so I think that is. Would you say your miniseries were based on that, right? Where you were basing the miniseries not just on history, but also on some of the chapters in the book of Revelation?
Yeah, absolutely. What we're trying to show, we're trying to highlight this idea that none of this has caught God by surprise, and we could have known all along the way what was going on. And so it's anchored completely. What we're doing is showing how Christians used to read Revelation. And once you understand that, particularly chapters 12, 13, and 14, which sort of form the centerpiece of the book of Revelation, once you start to see it all come together, you realize this book makes huge. You can read Revelation just as comfortably as you read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
And that's exciting, because I think for some people, they might think, even those listening who maybe have been Christians for a long time,
right?
Just have maybe convinced themselves that Revelation is for the pastor and the scholars at the seminary, but that's not something that I can really understand. And so, but it's exciting what you're saying, because it's not true, and I think that's essentially why you and I both are so excited about sharing Bible prophecy, because when you teach and understand some of these principles of interpretation, then it becomes much easier, and it's like, oh wow, this does make sense, and that's what I'm excited about your next miniseries that's coming out in January 2020.
Yeah,
it's
just in time for the next presidential election cycle.
Yeah. And tell us, is this kind of the continuing the story, right, of Revelation 12 and 13?
Yeah, it absolutely is. You see these profound, they're really sort of very impressive and to some people frightening statements being made in a chapter like Revelation 13. And here you got this beast that crawls up out of the sea, and you got a beast that's on the land, And what we're going to do in this next series is show you that it actually makes perfect sense. It's not somebody's fantastic, they ate pizza at midnight and had horrible nightmares and wrote it down. There's logic to it. It makes sense. And in Final Empire, we're going to move, those chapters reveal what happened with Constantine and so on, and we're going to take it right down to the end zone to stuff that isn't in the past anymore, but is laying just over the horizon. So yeah, we are continuing on with building an understanding of chapters 12 and 13 in particular in the book of Revelation. I think people find it mind-blowing that, the things that are going on in America today, well, the specifics aren't, named. We don't have names of presidents and congressmen and senators, but the general playing field that exists today certainly does appear to have been predicted, and there are some interesting things there to learn about what we can expect next.
Yeah, I think especially when you compare what we're headed towards and with an accurate understanding of what we came from, because it kind of, when you ended Pale Horse Rides, it was like right at the beginning or the dawn of the Reformation. And
Exactly.
Of course, the Reformation is what spawned the United States of America. The United States of America is the child of the Reformation. And
absolutely. Yeah, it is.
And so when we look forward now, so you kind of can't separate, even though we know that the country itself was founded on principle of no king, no pope, and religious liberty, and that's essentially what the experiment, the Great American Experiment, was all about. But
sure.
now in 2020, you kind of have to not be watching the news at all to kind of see a change happening, not only in the United States of America, but also the church. So what concerns you most, and I don't know how much you want to tease about what you guys are going to be talking about, but
let's talk about that, because you're right. The United States of America, and we're going to demonstrate that in this series, it is a child of the Reformation. You're completely right about that. That was also predicted in prophecy. And the American experiment is unique in human history. There have been other republics, but not like this one. Here's a republic that is born with the notion of religious liberty woven through it, that people can coexist. And that this is what God wanted here on earth at this time. There have been other experiments with religious liberty. The Dutch Republic, was the freest nation of its day in the 1600s, and those who were being persecuted, like the Jews in Spain, they were fleeing to the Netherlands. A lot of the non-Church of England Protestants who wanted to, exercise freedom of faith, like the Fifth Monarchists and the Barrowists and so on, they're all fleeing to the Netherlands, and there they begin to examine the scriptures. And as you say, they're saying to themselves, my goodness, Israel once asked for a king to be involved in the church, and that ruined them, and that's what we did with Constantine. What if we could find a place where we don't have a pope or a king that is running the show, and everyone has the ability to worship God according to the dictates of their own conscience? It's born entirely out of the Reformation, but we've lost a sense of history now, and we no longer understand that. And what worries me, I guess, and concerns me, and maybe drives Final Empire a little bit, is just how quickly our generation seems to be willing to part with what the forefathers, our forefathers in this nation fought so hard for. Now, our forefathers weren't perfect. In the Massachusetts Bay Colony, they hung Mary Dyer for being a Quaker. They got it wrong a bunch of times before they got it right. But they got it right. And I remember, it's a famous quote because it's become a meme all over the internet, but Ben Franklin once said, those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. So they're looking at what they've built. You've got liberty now. Be very careful that you don't give it up in an emergency or a crisis and cede this, because it's only happened once in the history of the world, and it's going to be hard to keep it together. And I guess that's my number one concern, Travis. We're looking at a world now that seems to be ignorant of why this nation exists and what we were given by the people who fought so hard to give it to us. So now we have, I think anybody watching the news can see what's going on. You're only allowed to speak on a college campus if your ideology matches that of the students on that campus, and otherwise you're told you may not speak. And we see people being cut out of social media platforms if they say the wrong things. Now, social media platforms are not government. Those are privately owned, and the owners have the right to do what they want. But the trend is, you disagree with me, you must be silenced. And we're appealing to the state to do that. We want laws that silence people who don't agree with us, and that's a dangerous place to go. It's where we came from when we built this nation in the first place. And we're going to show that that also was predicted in Bible prophecy, and that we need to recognize what's going on, and as Christians, preserve liberty, not just for ourselves, but for everybody, because this was a unique gift of God that is not going to repeat. And I think we ought to fight for it as long as we can. We can't sacrifice other people's freedoms to make ourselves comfortable. That is not what this nation was.
Yeah, I mean, it's just really amazing to me to just, and I'm not that old, and just to see the changes that have happened in the last 20 years. Basically, since 9/11, we've been on this kind of trajectory moving away from freedom and moving more towards restriction of freedom in this country, and you see it around the world. And right now, you see a reaction to that, right? You see protests happening all over the world.
Yep.
And we're not into prognosticating about or speculating, but there's clearly a recognition of the abuse of power that seems to be the trend around the world, and people, I think, are going to be wanting to know, okay, what does the Bible say about this rise of power and the abuse of power?
Right.
And I think that's essentially what Revelation 13 teaches, right? I mean, if you go and look at it,
Absolutely.
and I don't want to go, too much into detail, but it's interesting,
no, we don't
right?
want to give the story away. People need to come watch the series, but yeah.
But Revelation 13 and 14, you find this warning about receiving the mark of the beast. And and so without going into a detailed explanation, what would you say to our listeners is the principle behind this? What is God trying to say principally with this warning? And then what would you say is the most misunderstood aspect to it? Because sometimes when you just say mark the beast, people just roll their eyes or they just give you a look of confusion. So kind of like just share with our listeners, the principle behind it, and then kind of what would you say is most misunderstood about it?
Yeah, and you know what? The eye roll, I think a lot of us as Christians have earned the eye roll because of the way that we've mishandled that. Here we live in this environment where Christians lift one verse out of the Bible, build an entire theory on it, and ignore the historical context that John's first century audience would have understood. They ignore the biblical context that brings light to what is being said. The mark of the beast is a concept that is taught all through the Bible, Old and New Testament. And without that information, you come to these really odd and frankly new interpretations. So ever since I was a kid, people have been saying, mark of the beast, it's going to be, they're going to hold you down, put a tattoo on your forehead, and you're lost. Well, that doesn't make sense in light of a loving God that, I could hold you down, Travis, mark your forehead, and you're lost. I mean, that's not what it's talking about. What we get in the Bible is a really simple story. You have to read the whole book if you want to understand what's going on in Revelation 13. And the whole book says the whole world was once God's kingdom. We rejected him. We walked out on our own voluntarily. And God could have wiped us out, but he loved us too much to do that. And so we have these two sides emerge early in the story, way back, beginning in Genesis, right in the beginning of the story. You get these cities built by Nimrod, or the Babylonians would have called him Gilgamesh. The Assyrians would have called him Gilgamesh. And they're human empires. And so what we have in the Bible is the story of human kingdoms pitted against the kingdom of God, and God allowing us to do this experiment in self-government. And what happens in Bible prophecy is God shows us the reality of the mess we've made, the pain and the suffering He's He loves us enough to show us what we have done. But then he always holds out, here's my solution. Here's how I can restore what used to be and how my kingdom will solve your worst problems. This is why you see in Bible prophecy, Revelation 11, the final decision is the kingdoms of this world will become the kingdoms of our Lord and his Christ, and he will reign forever. You look at Daniel 7, there's a solemn judgment scene, and at the end of that, Jesus is given dominion and glory over all people, nations, and languages, and he gets a kingdom that lasts forever. And that theme shows up again and again and again and again and again. What you have in Revelation 13 is the culmination of human government, of human effort, rather, to run this planet ourselves and the giant mess that we make. And then you got to keep on reading into Revelation chapter 14, where God has his people gathered on Mount Zion. It's a symbol of his kingdom, and how he plans to replace all of the pain and suffering and the misery we've caused with an everlasting kingdom where Revelation 21 says he wipes away all our tears. No more pain, no more sorrow, no more crying, no more death. And so what you have in Revelation 13, Mark of the Beast, is so much broader than just like a computer chip or a tattoo. It's a decision. Where are we going to go? Are you going to finally admit that human kingdoms cause disaster and that what we need is the kingdom of Christ? Or are you going to stick with the way the world is? And there's the decision that is there under the mark of the beast. It's so much more profound than the science fiction movies that we've been cranking out in the last few years.
Yeah, and I think when I've approached that topic with people, there just seems to be this underlying fear or underlying almost like it's conspiracy or something like that when you bring it up, and it's really not. It's a simple. I like what you were saying about it's simply I like to explain it by just the example from the three Hebrews in Daniel chapter 3.
Exactly. Yeah.
I don't know if you ever use that to kind of try to
I do.
Share the principle behind it.
It's definitely borrowing. Revelation 13 is definitely borrowing from that chapter in the book of Daniel, no question about it.
And so essentially, it's just like you said, it's a decision. Do we stand up or do we bow down? And the pressure, of course, in the last days is going to be to bow down. As in that story. Right. Everybody, the peer pressure was great, and yet, the fidelity and the faithfulness of those three Hebrews allowed them to stand, and that's kind of what we want. That's why we're teaching Bible prophecy. That's why I'm doing Adventology, and I know that's why you're doing Voice of Prophecy, is to encourage people to stand, right? Encourage people to not just go with the flow of the world. That God is real. That God is His way is better. His plan is better, and the wool is definitely over the eyes of the world, and yet. The promise is that God is going to light the world with this truth before He comes. So
right. Revelation 18:1, absolutely.
Yeah. So I'm excited. We're going to be participating with you guys at my church in Daytona Beach. And if you end up listening to this episode after that time, I'm sure you're still going to be able to find it, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, you can still get your hands on this stuff. You're going to have to go to, we're setting up sort of like in Daytona Beach study centers. It's more than just, we've gathered footage from all over the world. We're telling a story that has long been forgotten. We're going to tell the story of why Columbus actually crossed the ocean. It had nothing to do with proving that the world was round. It had everything to do with the unfolding of Bible prophecy. We're going to talk about America, what it was supposed to be, the mess we're making out of it, maybe cast a little bit of light on what's going on in America today, and then give an opportunity to actually learn to study prophecy for yourself. We don't want to just give opinions. What we want to do is give people the tools they need to read it for themselves and understand it and see the broader historical context. And so if you're listening to this in advance, you can find out about this. Go to finalempire.com and you can find a location near you. We know you can get to it at Daytona Beach, and this will be worth this will be worth your time. It's short, it's punchy, and there's going to be opportunity for study materials that I think you'll really, really enjoy. So, man, I'm looking forward to this one more than just about any of the rest, because this is sort of the third in the trilogy and really starts looking at the day we live in.
So if they wanted to get a hold of the previous two miniseries, is that something that it is available to get as well?
Yeah, we're working with groups and churches all across the nation that are discovery centers, and that's the place that you want to go to find that stuff. I think you can get your hands on it by going to voiceofprophecy.com. Sure, it's not available on YouTube or Netflix at this point. You want to go to voiceofprophecy.com and see if you can get a hold of it there, or Travis, I'm sure they could ask you. You can get your hands on this stuff.
Definitely, yeah. We and then we can even make it. It's fun. Some of these, Hollywood movies that make trilogies. Sometimes people they make these watch parties, right? And they come and
oh, that'd be fun.
And they watch all three at once, and that's something then that I think adds to the message when you see it all together and you see the big picture of how God is working through history.
Oh man, I'd never thought of that. We should do like a marathon day where you can watch all.
There you go.
I think all told, we have some other Bible prophecy series in there as well, but the historical ones, I think the whole series you could watch one. How many are there? 9. There's like 13 or 14 episodes. You could spend a day going through this stuff, and I think it would be well worth the time. I think I'm going to steal your idea.
Well, man, thanks so much for coming on with me, Shawn. I know you're super busy, and this was a privilege to have you. And just as a final word, just kind of going back to your personal experience, how does Bible prophecy personally give you hope? As you look around and you see the mess that the world just seems to be sinking farther and farther into, and you look at the church and doesn't always give us the best example of what gives you hope as you look forward?
Here's something interesting that Jesus once said. It's in John 14. He's talking about the fact that when he goes back to heaven, he's going to send the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit will bring to mind the things that Jesus taught. And then he says something really interesting about the purpose of prophecy. So often people say, well, prophecy is you use the word prognosticate, and that's right. A lot of Christians have embarrassed themselves by trying to use prophecy to prognosticate. What Jesus says, it's in John 14, verse 29, I've told you before it comes, that when it does come to pass, you may believe. I have peace of mind because I've started studying prophecy, and when things happen, you go, that's what he was talking about. It's the purpose of it is to recognize God at work when he is at work. It's not about prognosticating the future. And the peace of mind that gives is like every signpost has been absolutely accurate. I used to live up on the Alaska highway, and in some of the blizzards, they were white-knuckle blizzards. I would be driving for hours on end, and you couldn't even see the front of your car, let alone the edge of the road. And I'm driving along, and suddenly I see a radio tower with a blinking light, and I think, I'm 30 miles from my house now. That gives me hope. I'm almost there. And then another 10 miles go by, and I see the glow of my town on the horizon. Man, I'm almost home. And what prophecy does for me, Travis, is like, my goodness, we are really close to getting home. I can see the glow on the horizon. Everything God said would happen has happened. And the mind-blowing part is we're almost right down at the very end. We're running out of things that still have to happen. The peace of mind that gives you, that God's in control, he cares enough to show you where you are and how close you are to home, man, that's a great way to live.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Adventology. Our goal on this podcast is for you to be ready for Jesus. And the best way to be ready for Jesus is to spend time getting to know him. Knowing Jesus is everything. And that is why we spent the time today studying the importance of Bible prophecy with Pastor Shawn Boonstra. But don't just take my word for it, study it out for yourself. And for a hands-on experience, I encourage you to check out our website, Adventology.com, where you can find the show notes, from this episode and the transcripts from all the previous episodes that we have published. And while you're there, don't forget to check out finalempire.com as well to find out where you can catch Shawn in January. Also, if you like this episode, share it with a friend, or better yet, please leave a rating and a review from wherever you downloaded this podcast from. All right, well, I enjoyed our time together today, and I look forward to seeing you in our next episode of Adventology. Until then, Maranatha.